नमस्कार दर्शक मित्रों, लोकसभा में नेता प्रतिपक्ष अगर उनका जो उद्बोधन है वो आपने ध्यान से सुना है तो एक बार नहीं कई बार मणिपुर का उल्लेख हुआ है। ऐसे सदन में और सदस्यों ने भी मणिपुर का उल्लेख किया। मणिपुर की बात करें तो पूर्वांचल आ ही जाए, पूर्वोत्तर जो राज्य है वो भी आ जाते हैं। उसके साथ जुड़ा हुआ म्यांमार, उससे भी कुछ चीजें हम निकालेंगे। तो मणिपुर अकेला मायना रखता है, नहीं रखता ऐसा नहीं, मगर कुल मिला के आज जो हम चर्चा आपके सामने रखने वाले हैं वो चर्चा शायद ही और किसी चैनल कर पाए। ये चर्चा के लिए हमने हमारे विद्वान फाइनेंशियल जर्नलिस्ट दुर्जटी भट्टाचार्य जी को निमंत्रित किया है। स्वाभाविक है, उस एरिया से बिलोंग करते हैं। शिलोंग में मेरे ख्याल से इनका काफी समय बीता। आज भी उस एरिया के प्रति अपने दिल में एक भावना संजोरे हुए हैं और इसके लिए मैं नहीं मानता कि इनसे ज्यादा कोई निष्णात हमें प्राप्त हुआ होता। तो भट्टाचार्य साहब, आपका स्वागत है, तहे दिल से स्वागत है। आपने हमारे लिए समय निकाला, हमारे दर्शक मित्रों को मार्गदर्शन के लिए आप उपस्थित हुए। हम आपका स्वागत करते हैं और शुरुआत करते हैं कि जिसका बारी बारी से उल्लेख हुआ। नेता प्रतिपक्ष ने तो जैसे मणिपुर के नाम की माला रट रखी थी। प्रधानमंत्री मणिपुर नहीं गए, एक दफा भी फोन करके नहीं पूछा, ये नहीं हुआ वो नहीं हुआ। काफी आक्षेप प्रति आक्षेप हुए हैं। तो ये आक्षेपों के बीच कुछ बातें कही गई, कुछ हो सकता है नहीं कही गई। जैसे वो अग्निवीर को 1 करोड़ रुपए मिलने वाली बात नेता प्रतिपक्ष ने कही थी और उसे रक्षा मंत्री जी ने काउंटर किया था कि इसमें कोई दम नहीं है, सदन में गलत बात नहीं रखनी चाहिए। और राजनाथ सिंह जी अपनी बात के बारे में सही थे, क्योंकि उन्होंने प्रिसाइजली गलत बात रखी थी जो बाद में नेता प्रतिपक्ष ने उनके सामने पुरवार कर दी कि सरकार की ओर से एक ढेला भी शहीद अग्निवीर के फैमिली को नहीं मिला। थोड़ी बहुत भी जो कुछ सहाय मिली वो पंजाब सरकार की ओर से मिली। अब मुद्दे पे आते हैं। तो भट्टाचार्य साहब, है मणिपुर का मसला कहां से पैदा हुआ? इसमें जो कुकी की बात आती है, बर्मा भी कहीं कहीं आ जाता है बात में।
देखिए,
एक्चुअली ये मसला इतना कॉम्प्लिकेटेड है कि मेरी आपसे पहली विनती यह है कि आप इसको सरल भाषा में इसकी परतें खोल के रख दे ताकि एक आम आदमी इसे समझ सके।
देखिए, जहां तक मणिपुर की बात है, पिछले 1 साल से मणिपुर सुलग रहा है। हम सबको पता है कि मणिपुर हाई कोर्ट ने सजेस्ट किया था कि मैतेई जो मेजॉरिटी कम्युनिटी है उनको ट्राइबल स्टेटस देने के लिए रेकमेंड किया था, जिसके चलते हिल के सारे जो आदिवासी है वो प्रोटेस्ट करने लगे, और इसके बाद ये सारा मामला ने तूल पकड़ा। खैर, लेकिन पिछले 1 साल से मणिपुर सुलग रहा है, लेकिन इसके जब ये हो रहा था, एक चीज जो हमारे सामने बार बार आया और जो हमें समझने की जरूरत महसूस हुई कि this entire trouble of Northeast is it's Manipur is just one case, but the entire tribal states have been restive for very, very long time. So why is it so, and what was the driving factor behind this? Now, जब हम मणिपुर नॉर्थ ईस्ट की तरफ देखते हैं तो एक चीज समझ में आता है कि ये जो ट्रबल है, दिस इज ऑल्सो अ परपेचुएशन ऑफ द अनफिनिश्ड एजेंडा ऑफ पार्टीशन ऑफ इंडिया. And
what do you mean by unfinished agenda?
I'm coming to that. And when I'm not just talking about the unfinished agenda, but I'm also talking about the first partition of India, which is the partition of the then Burma or Myanmar from India that happened in 1937. Right? So, मैं दर्शकों को याद दिला दूं कि ब्रिटेन इंडो-बर्मीज वॉर, 3 इंडो-बर्मीज वॉर हुए थे between 1824 to 1874, and after that on 1874 the then Burma was fully annexed, and it was being administered from Kolkata, with Yangon or the Rangoon at that point in time being the capital of Burma. Now, gradually there were nationalistic movement had come up, and the whole idea of separating Burma from India was discussed during Montego-Chelmsford reforms process, but it did not really materialize because the British government had decided to retain Burma with India for military reasons. In the late 20s, when Simon's Commission came, a representation was made to Simon's Commission by the Burmese nationalists, and what is called a secret memorandum to separate Burma from India. Based on this, in 1932, a plebiscite was held.
दर्शक मित्रों, इस सेंटर में आप बर्मा का नक्शा देख रहे हैं.
So, a plebiscite was held, and the separatists had lost the election to the anti-separatist body by 42 to 29 seats. In spite of it, Burma was separated from India in April 1, 1937. Now, what happened? On April 1, 1937, the Guardian had reported the incident this way, I quote, "The election was held. To the distress of government and the parties opposed to separation obtained a 2-1 majority. The reasons of the majority may have been misguided. They may have misunderstood the nature of federation partnership, which forms the only alternative to separation, or it may have been a subtle gesture in favor of complete independence. In any case, British government decided that the Burmese didn't know their own mind and went ahead with separation and an elaborate constitution." That happened. Eventually, Burma got its freedom in 1948. Interestingly, देखिए, कि 1948 से लेकर आज तक Burma or Myanmar has never been in peace. So it has been in a constant state of civil wars. In the last decade, it kind of veered towards some semblance of democracy and peace, but that did not last long. So in 21, junta took over, and it has been in the situation of a civil strife since then. Meanwhile, जब बर्मा का इंडिपेंडेंस हुआ, इसी दौरान British government in India, I mean some of the British officials who were posted in Northeast, they were also realizing that one, British would eventually leave India, and what would happen to the hill tribes of Northeast. So they were sort of preparing a range of reports, range of proposals on what could be done and how these areas could be administered. So some of these officials had come up with this whole idea of a separate northeastern frontier protectorate, including the Jantia Hills and other hills areas of Assam, the Naga and the Lushai Hills, which is the modern Mizoram, Manipur, and all these areas which border Myanmar. The first name that comes in mind when we talk about these plans is Dr. J.H. Hutton, who was for many years Deputy Commissioner of the Naga Hills. Now, Mr. Hutton wrote 3 different separate notes on the same subject, one on 1928, one in 1930, and one in 1935. Now, we are not getting into all those notes. Let me just quote a part from his second note that he wrote on July 6, 1930. I quote, "A much more attractive alternative would be the formation of an agency or commission to combine the hill districts of Assam with adjacent districts of Burma. The districts which I would suggest for this purpose are starting from the Bay of Bengal, the hill tracts of Arakan, Pokoku, and Chittagong, and the Chin Hills, and the Lushai Hills, and the North Kachar Hill, the Naga Hills, the Mikir Hills, the part of Upper Chindwan district, and the hill areas administered on the west bank of Chindwan, from the Upper Chindwan district, from the Hakang Valley, together with Sadia and Balipara frontier tracts, the Lakhimpur frontier tract, the states of Manipur and Tripura, and the isolated Shan states of Thangdut on the west bank of Chindwan." Now, if you look at these areas, these are the exact areas which are restive till today. Now, he goes on to write, it would be a province for which it would be extremely easy to recruit in Europe, which is not likely to be the case with any province in which service under a reformed local government is normal. The other advantages of such a solution of the problem of Assam backward tracts are many. From the Arakan Hills to northward, Mugs, Mros, Kukis, Lakars, Chins, all Nagas of all sorts, Khamtis, and the western Kachins are found on both sides of this so-called watershed, having common customs, common language, and living under the precisely similar social conditions. All these social tribes, at present divided between 2 administrations, would gain enormously by consolidated treatment and sentiment, which is at present parochial as a result of divided administration. Now, the next came in the lane came Mr. Robert N. Reid, who was the governor of Assam between 1937 and 1942. Now, actually, it was Mr. Reid who put out the idea formally for the first time that the hill people of the region should be given special attention by the British government. Within his note that he wrote in 1941 is the concept of crown colony for Northeast India and the hill region of Burma. Now, crown colony became a very, very interesting concept over time, and this is what Reid.
Can you explain a little bit more, elaborate on that? Ground colony kya hai? Kya?
See, the crown colony is what I was just reading, quoting my earlier parts. The hill tribes were to be brought under one separate political entity, preferably under the Britishers, as they say, HMG, that's Her Majesty's government, or otherwise a separate political entity that would decide its own fate and eventually would join or not the Indian Confederation. So basically, it was to create a buffer political entity, geopolitical entity between India and Myanmar, comprising of the hill tribes who are essentially Christian. Now, I'm also bringing in religion here because all the officials over and over harped on the commonness of these tribes, which was religion. Now, Reid in his note writes, and what he called a note on the future of the present excluded, partially excluded, and tribal areas of Assam. He writes, and I quote, "Now as to the future, this of course would have to be decided by Parliament. It cannot be left to Indian political leaders with neither knowledge, interest, nor feeling for these areas. In any case, in my main premise of separation from India is accepted, their intervention could scarcely arise. I take as my text where Mr. Amri said on 3rd March of 1941 of Burma and her separation from India, and he quotes, that separation was the natural consequence of the introduction of self-government for her racial type and her culture, as well as her geographical position. Burma belongs not to India, but to the easternmost of the great southward projection of the main bulk of Asia, the Indo-Chinese peninsula. Here, his quote ends. This applies just as closely to the inhabitants of Assam excluded and tribal areas, and I consider to the partially excluded areas too, when one emerges from the hills into the plains of Assam, one enters a different world, whereas the boundary between our hills and the Burma hills are as artificial as it is imperceptible. Then he goes on. In the hill tracts of Assam.
Don't you think in your, I mean, because you know the entire background, so it is natural as well कि आप थोड़ा ज्यादा स्पीड पकड़ गए. अब म्यांमार के प्लेबिसाइड उसमें क्या हुआ, क्या किया गया, क्यों किया था, ये सब बातें जो है, क्या रिजल्ट आया उसका? Did they reject joining India or did they reject remaining with India? They wanted separate Myanmar. क्या था, क्या हो, रिजल्ट क्या था?
म्यांमार का जो मैंने पहले कह चुका था, that the nationalist group that wanted separation, they got 29 seats, whereas the group that wanted to stay with India got 42 seats. And that's exactly what the Guardian also reported. Because largely there was a feeling that the time was not ripe for Myanmar to move away from India. But then the Burma racial chauvinism that propelled the whole thing, and British government had a feeling that the anti-Indian sentiment would lead to further riots and violence in
that means two extreme situations, two extreme decisions. In case of Kashmir, Pakistan wanted Janmat Sangra plebiscite, and we opposed to it. The thing went up and ended up in, you know. Here, the people decided, they gave their verdict that we want to join India, and they were denied that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's what happened. So, and why this is important is that the plebiscite and the denial of popular verdict and then successive separation did not yield the kind of results that one would have hoped for. And Myanmar has been in a state of constant strife since then. And this is something that becomes very...
Supposing a hypothetical situation,
Ji.
supposing Myanmar was permitted to be with India, तो क्या होता?
That is a very, I mean, probably it's not, I mean, it's not my place to make a conjecture, but the way things have happened, one can imagine that the separation would have happened at a later stage, but when the ethnic cauldron would have settled a little more, which did not happen because the entire idea of racial chauvinism that we see in both sides of the border has remained largely unaddressed. And Myanmar's entire conflict comes from these clashes of chauvinisms. So that could have settled.
It's a kind of racial conflict all through.
Absolutely, it's an ethnic conflict, and that would have settled down. But now, I mean, eventual separation would have happened, but that would have happened when the people were ready for it.
Right.
So that is something, and we really need to remember this, because Myanmar, we also had an open border policy with Myanmar. So this became virtually a sanctuary for the insurgents from Northeast over time. A proper separation on very specific, clear terms, adhering to the wishes of the people, would have ensured that such things do not happen, and we had a much more clearer boundary, clearer stance, and that would have helped us deal with our side of the border.
So if I understand correctly, it were Britishers who did want Myanmar to get annexed with India.
Well, it certainly appears so, and also there was a...
What was their interest during that period, 1938?
I mean, also there was a significant section of the Myanmar nationalists who wanted to move out. There was a significant section. I mean, memorandum was presented to Simon's Commission in this regard. That led to the plebiscite. So Britishers also were fearing a kind of a reprisal against the Indians and some violence in Yangon, and that is the official reason given behind the whole thing.
But when, in that case, Bhattacharya Sahib, when the situation became so that there was a coup, Navy took over and Utha was thrown out, and virtually Indians were chased out.
Absolutely.
So why it so happened that once upon a time they wanted to be with India, the other time they chased out Indians? Two diagonally opposite decisions.
Absolutely. And this is a very interesting question. As I kept on talking about the racial chauvinism, because the nationalistic movement that was gaining ground in Myanmar, they had this overriding fear of overpopulated India vis-a-vis their sparsely populated and very, very different landscape of theirs. So they were feeling the exploitative nature of Indian population, because a lot of people were shifting to Myanmar, and some kind of anti-Indian sentiments were anyway growing, and that was the
What was the
point.
reason? But I mean, I understand, because when they were when Utha was sent out and Nevin came and so on and so forth, the Indians were chased out virtually. They had to leave with bags and
Right, right,
baggages
right.
overnight. तो
Absolutely,
क्या
absolutely.
reason क्या था इसका? Why
Reason
all
यही
of a
था
sudden such a
no, because
hatred developed?
that gained ground over time. That's what I'm saying, that these sentiments gained ground over time, because after the separation of Myanmar, it was all racial chauvinism that ruled the entire discourse in Myanmar. So once, while they were largely friendly towards Indians, things changed after the partition.
Okay,
So
makes sense. Yeah.
So that's what happened. Now, that is one side, but more importantly, we are talking about our side of the thing. So,
Yeah.
in our side, this is what was happening, and as I'll come back to Robert Reid. Now, Robert Reid, when he talks about the tribes, the hill tribes, which would include the Nagas, the Abors, the Lushais, or the Mizos, or the Zos, what he writes is, in hill tracts of Assam, I quote, Muslims and Hindus are almost everywhere, confined to the small district and subdivisional headquarters, and there have been no widespread infiltration of members of these advanced communities into primitive animist populations such as occurred elsewhere in India. The population of the area we are considering can, for practical purposes, be regarded as solid block of animists in rapid process of becoming Christians. The speed of that process is proved by the fact that between 1931 and 1941, the Christian population of the hills of Assam, including the Khasi Hills, has increased from 1,64,000 to 2,51,000. We have no right to allow this great body of non-Indian animists and Christians to be drawn into the struggle between Hindu and Muslims, which is now
How this movement of taking the people to the Christianity fold took roots, and what was the reason for its strengthening during that period?
See, ever since the annexation of these lands, the missionaries, both from, American missionaries in the in Mizoram and Lushai Hills, the others in largely Nagaland, in some parts of Arunachal, and among the Zokuki people, largely the American missionaries, they were proselytizing, and almost 99% of the Kuki people became Christians over time. So this is something that, now, if you allow me to come back to the to
Manipur.
Reid's report. Now, so this is how he went on to talk about these areas, identifying them as growing Christian communities and in need for a special protection. Now, James P. Mills is another person who did the same thing, and he went on to write another note, which was allegedly a secret note that he soon published from Shillong. And historian David Siemle has a very interesting take. He writes is like, what motivated Mill to write that secret note remains largely unknown. But what Mill wrote was very, very interesting. The great religions of India, I quote, India proper, Hinduism and Islam are alien religions in these hills, where animism in various forms is the original faith of every tribe, but animism has not hardened into a communal creed and is giving way before impact of Buddhism in parts of northern hills and of Christianity elsewhere. The number of Buddhists south frontier of Tibet must be very considerable, but most of them inhabit in areas which we as yet know little or nothing. The Christian bloc is therefore the most immediate importance. This can be said to cover the Lushai Hills, Garo Hills, and if you look at the listing, the Lushai Hills, that's the Mizo Hills, the Garo Hills, Khasi and Jaintia Hills, and the Ao, Sema, and Lota tribes, which are the Naga Hills, and therefore probably the largest solid Christian bloc in India. It will certainly increase in size, and since Christianity is rapidly assuming a communal tinge, the existence of this expanding bloc must be taken into account. Now, while Mills writes this, he also tries to create a capital for this protectorate. And what is the place that he suggests? Interestingly, I mean, at that point in time, Shillong used to be the capital of Assam, which again falls in one of these areas, the Khasi Hills. But Mills was very clear on that. He did not want Shillong or Barapani, place next to Shillong, to be the capital. He picked up Imphal to be the capital. And Imphal, what he writes is, I quote, Imphal appears to offer greater advantages. From there, it is a short flight to Sadia in one direction, or Kachhat, whence the Lushai Hills can be reached. In the other, and if Tripura, Sikkim, etc. were included in the Union, access to them would be equally easy. In addition, the governor would be in one of his most important states, the Naga state, which would be within close reach, and communication with Burma, with which relations are likely to become closer, would be easy. So things
But
were...
in the meanwhile, if you see, I'm talking about post-independent independence
India.
phenomena. There were two things happening. One, some people migrating from Bangladesh. There's Bangladesh, East Pakistan at that time. And second are those Marwaris and tea garden wallahs who also started getting into that and made themselves entrenched. So,
Right.
what kind of sort of impression they left behind?
That is a separate question that we are right now I would address this a little later, but I'll come back to this question. Because right now, what I'm trying to build up or discuss is the West's influence on the whole thing. So, if you look at when these reports were being written and published, just for reference, Atlantic Charter was also signed between the US and England. Now, I'll just, out of 8 points of that charter, 3 points are very, very interesting, and that...
This charter was signed between whom?
Between the US and England. That's the Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill signed it in Newfoundland.
Was it the Second World War time?
Yes, it was signed on August 14, 1941.
Okay.
Now, what are the... I mean, it had 8 basic points, out of which 3 points are important for us here. The third point is that, I quote, they, the US and the UK, they respect the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live, and they wish to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them. The fourth point was, they will endeavor with due respect for their existing obligations to further enjoyment by all states, great or small, victor or vanquished, of access on equal terms to the trade and raw materials of the world, which are needed for their economic prosperity. And the fifth one, the desire of bring about the fullest collaboration between all nations in the economic field with the object of securing for all improved labor standards, economic advancement, and social security. Over time, this charter
So
had
they
a
accepted manufacturing as the vehicle for achieving that. Is that?
well, yes, and also I would again underline the third point. Sorry, the fourth point. They, that is the US and UK, will endeavor with due respect for their existing obligations to further the enjoyment by all states, great or small, victor or vanquished, of access on equal terms to the trade, to the raw materials of the world, which are needed for their economic prosperity. Now, this is largely the background of the restive area. 47, India gets its independence. 48, Myanmar gets its independence. But meanwhile, already we have this mess created, and that was not really our fault up to this point. Now, having said this, things did things move better from there on? It did not, right? So we did see Manipur joined Indian Union in 1949, and they had their aspirations. Similarly,
It was a princely state, is that?
It was a princely state. The Lushais, they were initially reluctant, but later joined. Lushais, that is the Mizos, the Zomi cookies. The Nagas had their reluctance, but then eventually joined. But the region remained restive. And the whole
Meaning
idea
thereby
of
that it did not solve the problem.
the problems were never really solved, right? We have the Naga insurgency is one of the longest running insurgencies of the world, right?
Yes.
So having said this area remained restive since that point. And while the Crown colony that we spoke about and all these notes that were written were actually over time jettisoned, the notions remained as they were. The ideas remained. Over time, one more thing that happened was that independent India was being viewed as a counterweight to China by the US from a very, very early point in time. So by 1962, they were very clear that the chasm between India and China is going to increase. And India will veer towards US over time for support. Now, given that kind of a situation, when we look at Manipur conflict today, things become very, very different, because it's just not the communal strife between the Meiteis and the Kukis. Because the Kukis, or the Zomi tribes as they call themselves, who are spread across Myanmar, hill tracts of Bangladesh, Mizoram, and Manipur, they have been asking for their own homeland for a long time, which happens to, and which essentially has a very religious nature to it, which they're not hiding. So they ask for a Christian state to be set up here. What becomes all the more sinister is when Begum Hasina, Bangladesh Prime Minister, last month, she spoke about a white man's proposal to allow Bangladesh to set up a base in Bay of Bengal. Bangladesh to allow a base there, or allow Chittagong Hill Tract to secede from Bangladesh, so that an independent Christian country can be formed. So this, when one couples that with the development.
By any chance, Subhash Babu's Azad Hind Fauj movement, did it have any impact on this?
The Kukis had, in fact, supported INA march with the hope, again, with the hope of setting up their own homeland. That if INA march succeeds, they would get their own homeland. So, but there where it ends, it doesn't move more than that. So this is the broad area that includes parts of Bangladesh, parts of Myanmar, and parts of India, which is being made restive. And it becomes all the more important because this is the time when everybody is looking towards an excess in Bay of Bengal. So while India is trying to protect its stuff, it's trying to establish another link to Northeast through Kaladan project. This entire idea of a separate nation that is being now fomented would allow somebody, some other forces also to have a toehold in Bay of Bengal. And that is what is more concerning. Because situation is fast changing also in Myanmar, if you look at it.
Myanmar is today being ravaged by the infights and
Absolutely.
whatnot.
Absolutely. Now, China is trying to, for China, this conflict is not a very conducive situation, because China is also trying to expand its business to Myanmar at the least, and then through Myanmar, base in Bay of Bengal. So China is in touch with the former Myanmar dictators, some of the generals, to broker some kind of a peace between the junta and the resistance forces. On the other hand, now we know that the US is also negotiating with the junta on one hand, and on the other, in Indian side, if you remember last year, the US ambassador to India had basically went on record to say that US would be ready to assist India to deal with the conflict in Manipur. And successive pressure that was mounted on India in terms of human rights by the Western media was essentially to allow the Chin refugees or the Zomi refugees from Myanmar to India. Now, a former diplomat, Mr. M.K. Bhadrakumar, has been warning that the whole idea of allowing the refugees, the Chin refugees in India, is basically an attempt to create a sanctuary for the Kuki National Army in India, where they can operate from India and carry out guerrilla warfare in Myanmar, which would essentially keep the area restive and therefore interests of the Western forces secured. So given this situation, it is very, very messy for India to get into any kind of a clear stand, because on one hand it's the interest of US is involved in the whole thing, and then there is China, and the theater being a conflict-ridden neighborhood.
But all of a sudden, from nowhere, how India got into this cobweb?
India was never out of it. India was never
in also, never in so much either. Yes, Naga insurgency, India was directly confronting. The Assam Gun Parishad, yes, India was directly confronting it, but not in Manipur directly.
Manipur, these insurgencies have been there since day one. Number one. Number two.
I am trying to ask you a pinpointed question. This insurgency and India's landing into it has something to do with Meiteis getting the tribal status?
No. Because we just discussed one side of it, because we have not covered the conflict between the Kukis and the Nagas that had happened, because the Kukis were used to contain the Nagas in the hill areas of Manipur. In 2022 Manipur elections, the Kuki terror outfits actually issued a decree to the people to vote for BJP.
Kukis?
Yes. So it is not that Indian administration over time have used these insurgent groups to its advantage as and when it could. But then a serious, sincere effort to solve the issues were hardly made. And that is where the problem starts.
Now, coming to the statement made by the leader of opposition in the parliament, the Prime Minister has not even found time to visit Manipur, or even telephonically ask and assures them about the problems they are facing. I mean, how you would look at it?
There are two things to it. I would look at it in two ways. One, for sure, the amount of sensitivity that the state that has been a victim of conflict for so long would have sought from the Prime Minister, it has not gotten it. It has not gotten the right kind of attention. It has not gotten the systemic healing touch. There is no two way about it. But for the Indian Prime Minister to take a stand on this conflict is very, very difficult, given the kind of complexities involved in the whole thing. But the least that one would have expected was a healing fatherly touch that Delhi was supposed to provide. And
so supposing that he didn't want to take a stand, all right, fine. He could have sent the foreign minister and in a tussle manner conveyed his message that I am sympathetic to you.
That's exactly what I'm saying. That the healing, humane touch, fatherly touch that the citizens of this country would need at the moment of their trouble. I believe the rights should be same for somebody in Gujarat or somebody in Manipur or somebody in Arunachal or somebody in Tamil Nadu. If somebody is a victim of some kind of a social or political violence, would look forward to systemic redressal or at least a healing touch.
Don't you think it is better said than done?
Pardon me?
Don't you think that it is better said than done?
Of course it is. Of course it is. I mean, something should have been done. Something should have definitely. I mean, some healing touch should have been provided. That has not been provided. I mean, the least of all, what could have been done was to acknowledge that it had happened at the highest level, and letting people know that the country cares. I mean, it's not enough that the local administration is trying to do something, or at least or making statements about it. The people have their sentiments and feelings hurt, and I believe justifiably so. But then taking a long-term stand for the prime minister would be complex because of the larger complexity of the issue that I tried to bring out so far.
Now, considering that we have some constraint of the time, what is the way out in Manipur? Will it continue, or will it be allowed to continue like the way it is? Or is there any way out?
This is going to be a very, very complex issue, and it is going to haunt us for a long time to come. Because everything would depend on our larger international interactions, the diplomatic interactions, as well as how efficient we are in protecting our interests, both nationally
At
and
one point of time, Bhattacharya, you were talking about rare earth and the kind of corridor and Americans' interest in creating a base in that area.
That's exact. That's exactly what I was talking about when I spoke about Begum Hasina's allegation and the whole notion of creating a separate country in this area that is brewing. So, creating a base, a Western base in the Bay of Bengal has always been an agenda. It has always been an agenda, and this is why this area remains so volatile all the time.
That means that it's sufficiently complicated with multiple interests trying to pull their own loaves of bread, and no solution may come out in that kind of a situation.
See, I do not see a clear, simple solution emerging in near future. It is going to be a very long process, and it would need superhuman efficiency and understanding of the complexities and commitment to deal with it.
So, do you think ever that stage will be reached?
Well, I remain hopeful. Because if we can at some point in time really understand the problem, we would probably make an effort to solve it. But that would
Man,
again depend on the political will and the necessity
what
to solve.
what
No,
is the
because
time?
I mean, I do not for it's difficult to say that it will even be solved, because it would again, the solution would emerge if a necessity for a solution comes. Unless there is a necessity for a solution, the solution may never emerge.
So I think it's a long way to go, and now that within Bangladesh, the social media is above with Quit India kind of a campaign which says that boycott Indian products and services. And that seems to be doing of the government of India by supporting the fourth time election in January this year of Sheikh Hasina's government, which is doing many things which are clandestinely done. So I think there is local complication, there is people who are otherwise opinionated or oriented. There are foreign powers who are interested for different reasons. And in a process, Manipur is not only India's ball game, it has become a multiple ball game.
Absolutely. This region invites attention from all over the globe, and let's not for a second think that it's restricted to just one player or the other or two. There are multiple players, multiple agencies, and multiple interests involved in the whole thing.
Okay.
So certainly,
I think for the time being, we stop here. We'll need to revisit it sooner than the later, and dissect and dissect and do whatever we can to further bring out those smaller pieces under microscope to examine them, whether they carry any malice or they carry any kind of a virus for spreading these diseases. Till then, I think Quit India, for altogether different reasons, will go on. So on one side Bangladesh, the other side Manipur, the third side China, and the fourth side you said the American interest. I think it's a jumbled up game and arrow of vectors. Which side the resultant will go is anybody's guess. So thank you very much for today's discourses. Very learned presentation on a very complex and complicated subject. Thank you so much.